Good afternoon, Justin.
Good afternoon.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Nice. You studied here
I did.
a while ago. So what were your Oxford stats?
Oh man, well this was a long time ago, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So I was here 1998 to 2001 at Brierley College, and I studied PPE.
PPE, nice. So what are you currently doing now?
So I've kind of spent most of my adult working life working in the area of broadcasting, but particularly helping Christians and non-Christians to come together for dialogue and debate, to look at the claims of Christianity, and to just have open, honest conversations about it. And that's kind of the area I'm still involved in, doing it through podcasting, video, writing, speaking, that kind of thing.
Right. Thank you so much, Justin. Throughout the talk, there'll be like an opportunity to scan the QR code on your tables to submit questions to the Slido. Write down your questions on Slido or on your phone somewhere so you don't forget them. I'm going to hand over to Justin now and let him get on with the talk for today.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to see everyone here. And as I said, I was a student here 25 years ago, believe it or not. And I remember going to similar events like this and benefiting from the lunch as well. So I kind of feel a little bit like I know what the experience is, but it's great to be back here, and a really strange feeling actually to be back to be able to share with you this afternoon. So thank you for coming out, and I hope what I have to share is helpful at some level. I've been involved in, as I said, trying to make sense of the Christian faith with Christians and non-Christians, speaking across the Christian-secular divide. So over the years, I've been involved in hosting conversations. There was a show called Unbelievable that I was involved in for 17 and a half years, bringing Christians and non-Christians together to debate the big claims about the universe, about the Bible, about the existence of God. And I learned a lot in the process and made a lot of friendships as well. But over the years, that's kind of come out in all kinds of other ways. TikTok is one thing, a more recent thing. So you can find my very short thoughts on God, Christianity, the case for faith, and that kind of thing if you go to justin.brierley on TikTok or Instagram Reels. But it's been really fun just having the opportunity to share in all kinds of environments why I think there is a good case for God, for Christianity, for faith. And one of the more recent things I've been involved in is a new book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which goes alongside sort of my first book, Unbelievable, which is sort of my case for Christian faith. I have bought some copies of those, so if you want to have a look at them, they'll be at the back at the end of the event. You can pay for them, but if that's in any way a barrier, feel free to just take a copy, and I'd love to meet anyone who wants to do that just at the end of the event. But if you're a podcast listener, there's also a podcast that goes with the new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And it's a book and podcast that essentially talks about a phenomenon that was termed the New Atheism. These are the so-called four horsemen of the New Atheism, but they include well-known people like Richard Dawkins, former Oxford professor, who led this movement in the mid-2000s, not long after I left Oxford, that was a very anti-God, anti-faith kind of movement where they had best-selling anti-God books, there were atheist bus campaigns. It was a real thing at the time, but the book and the podcast really talk about the rise and fall of that movement in recent years. And the way that I'm seeing actually an interesting new conversation with interesting people, kind of often from a secular perspective, asking questions again about whether we can live without the Christian story in our world. So if you want to check that out, it very much ties into some of the things I'm talking about in this session today, but that might be an interesting resource to go on and listen to. You're just looking for The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, the book or the podcast. But if there was one verse from the Bible that kind of encapsulates what I've been trying to do over all these years and with these different resources, it could be summed up in 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." Because one of the big claims that I've encountered time and again, often in conversations with atheists and skeptics, has been that, well, there's no evidence for Christianity. It's something you just believe on quote-unquote faith, which for many people seems to mean kind of you imagine it into existence, or you just sort of believe it because you want to believe in it. But actually, I think this verse, which was written to the very first Christians some 2,000 years ago, is evidence actually that there's always been this intellectual side to Christian faith. There's always been reasons why people believe. These may be personal reasons, but there are also reasons outside of us, objective reasons that we can all look at. I remember when I came to Oxford University as a student, I'd kind of had an experience of faith. I came as a Christian, but I quickly bumped into a lot of skeptical students around me, and I quickly had to learn that actually my personal experience wasn't necessarily shared by my peers, by other people I was meeting. So that brought me into the area of what's sometimes technically called apologetics. It's the idea of looking for reasons that we can both agree on and ask, well, what makes best sense of the evidence that's available to all of us? And in many ways, that's the approach I've often taken when talking about these issues. It's asking, what's the best explanation? Very often, when I've had conversations with Christians and atheists, there's often been an assumption sometimes on the part of the atheist that, well, I'm standing here as a kind of neutral observer, and it's up to the Christian over here to provide all of the evidence for these funny claims they have about God and heaven and the supernatural. But actually, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think everyone comes to life with a worldview, a way of looking at the world and understanding it. And what I came to realize is that my atheist friends often also came with their own set of assumptions about the way the world is, about the way the universe works. And often I could put the label on that sometimes of naturalism or materialism. It was the idea that all that ultimately existed was matter in motion, the laws of nature. Everything could ultimately be boiled down to atoms and electrons, essentially. Now, that is, if you like, a way of looking at the world. It's a set of beliefs about the world, and it's got some interesting outcomes to it. Because on that particular view, it means that ultimately you don't believe there's an ultimate purpose to the universe. We're here effectively by accident. And all the things we believe about truth and beauty, justice and love, they're all ultimately things we've invented. We've kind of put onto this purely natural universe. They don't exist in and of themselves. There were all kinds of corollaries to that as well. Interesting conversations that came out of that worldview. And I realized that, yes, if I'm a Christian over here, I've certainly got my perspective and my beliefs to defend and justify, but actually, my atheist friend also has to justify how they make sense of life, given their worldview, that actually all there is matter in motion in the end. And as I've hosted conversations and thought about this myself, I've realized actually, I think there's really good evidence that the Christian worldview, that there is a creator God behind the universe, I think that makes better sense of a lot of the evidence that's available to us. Better sense, if you like, than the naturalist atheist perspective. It's not that there aren't reasons to be an atheist, it's just I find that overall, on balance, the Christian story of a God behind the universe seems to make better sense of certain aspects of what we all are looking at. And so I just want to share 3 of those reasons today. And I've called this talk, The Case for God from Science, Value, and Purpose. So if there's anything you can take away, hopefully it's just 3 particular reasons why I think there's good evidence for a creator God from these 3 reasons that makes better sense than the atheist perspective on life. So the first one, the case for God from science. In many ways, this was the drum that was beaten by those new atheists back in the early 2000s. Many of them were scientists, and they were making the case that now that we have science, now that we have explanations for how life arose on Earth, we don't need God. That was kind of just something people used as a placeholder, but the more we know about the world through science, the less reason we have to believe in God. I think, however, that it's rather been the opposite story in many ways. As I brought on many people on both sides of this debate, scientists, I realized there's another story of science that's actually been at play over the last several decades. Because the more we actually know about our universe, the more extraordinary it appears to be, especially when it comes to the fact that we exist in it. The existence of you and I is not at all obvious as to why we're here, given what had to happen in order for us to be here. There's this quite extraordinary phenomenon that we have debated a number of times on the shows I've hosted, called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. And it's just the idea that basically the universe was set up in such an incredibly precise way in terms of the fundamental numbers, constants, and laws that had to be just the way they are in order for chemistry to occur at some point in the universe, in order to be able to sustain life in planets and galaxies and so on. It's a bit of a, it's quite an in-depth topic to get into, but I have tried to boil it down into a short video, which I'm going to play now, if that's okay, just to give a sense of the kind of numbers involved and just how unlikely it is that we're here simply by chance. Thank you.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times, and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
So it's a fantastically interesting area, and one obviously I've seen debated back and forth. And I'm not saying that this is a slam dunk argument for the existence of God, but it's just one way in which I think science is asking questions beyond itself. There was a well-known physicist, Fred Hoyle, who, when this phenomenon began to be discovered, said this: a common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Now, Hoyle was an atheist, but he recognized that something was going on here. As I say, this doesn't force us necessarily to the conclusion that there's a God behind the universe, but it does raise significant questions for me. And when I add that to other interesting aspects of what science is revealing about the fact the universe appears to have had a beginning in time and space, which naturally raises the question, well, what started the universe? The fact that life itself, there is this extraordinary mystery around how the first self-replicating DNA molecule came into existence. The fact that we can do science, actually, the fact that the universe is written in the laws of physics and mathematics. Again, as Eugene Wigner has said, the prize-winning physicist, this seems like an extraordinary miracle. It's either an extraordinary fluke or it's something akin to a miracle. I think when you put all of these pieces of evidence together, and you're simply asking, does the view that there's God, a mind behind the universe, or the view that this is all essentially an accident, which makes best sense of this evidence? I would say, actually, it coheres better. God is a better explanation of these aspects of the scientific world. There's a sense in which, though, we can go from out there, the scientific account of reality, to very much looking inside as well. And that's not the second point I want to bring across. The case for God from value, specifically human value. I had a really interesting conversation several years ago here at Oxford University when I came to see Richard Dawkins, the well-known atheist I mentioned earlier, in conversation with another Oxford professor, John Lennox, who still lives not far away. And he's a Christian thinker, a professor of mathematics and philosophy of science. And they came together for a debate at the Oxford Natural History Museum. And they had a wonderful time kind of going back and forth on the question of God. And afterwards, there was a sort of little after party where I managed to get my first interview for my show with Richard Dawkins. And we had a really interesting conversation. I'm just going to literally read you verbatim how part of this conversation went, because it touched on this question of human value. So this was with Richard Dawkins. And I said to him, but if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favors is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say the reason this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? And he said, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he responded, you could say that, yes. And you could say that, and I think if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist, you should say that. I think Richard Dawkins was being perfectly logically consistent with his worldview. There is ultimately no moral law out there. We just kind of invent what we believe is right. And that's going to vary in different times and places according to the different evolutionary stories that have, shaped different cultures. There have been cultures in the past where rape was perfectly acceptable. If you go back to Greco-Roman times, a Roman male could have his way with anyone who was essentially his social inferior. So there have obviously been many cultures around the world where there was no issue with this, and yet we instinctively recoil at the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand that evolution happens to have dealt us in this time and place. Actually, I don't know about you, but I feel like some things are really right and some things are really wrong. There are better and worse ways to treat human beings, regardless of how we happen to have evolved those particular beliefs. To me, that speaks of something much deeper than just some purposeless process, us just inventing morality out of thin air. I think there's a deep moral sense that we have because we're actually made in the image of a moral God. I think the idea that humans have intrinsic value and dignity makes really good sense if we are, as the Bible says from page 1, made in the image of God. If we are ultimately the end result of a blind, purposeless process, it's very hard to see why we should consider humans as having this intrinsic value and dignity, when ultimately we're just one more byproduct on a tree of life, essentially. There's a story that I tell in one of my books about a wealthy businessman called Jem Jaramillo who discovered on the streets of Bogota children who were being essentially gunned down by off-duty policemen. These were street kids. And one of the kids had a note pinned to them that said, "I killed you because you had no education and no future." And that was the value that that person put on that child's life. Now, at one level, you could measure a life like that. How do we measure the value of someone? Is it basically who they are, their education, their ability to produce wealth, their usefulness to society? I don't know about you, but again, it seems to me that value, when it comes to human beings, we can't simply put a value on people in that way. And when Jem Jaramillo took those street kids and put them in a loving Christian community to give them an education and a home, it was because he saw the value of everyone. Whether you're a street kid in Bogota or a millionaire in a penthouse, for some reason we've got this idea in us, haven't we, that human life is valuable regardless. Where does that come from? I haven't found a good explanation for that on a purely atheistic account of reality, but I think there is a good explanation. If we're made in the image of God, every life is intrinsically valuable, precious. So I think God makes sense of this idea of human value. So God, if you like, makes sense of the scientific account of why we're here. God makes sense of human value. I think God also makes sense of human purpose. And this is my final slide, if I can make it come up. Because we all ask that why question. I mean, that is just a question that you will find across every time, place, and culture. People asking, is there more to life than this? There's a really interesting story of a woman called Jennifer Fulwiler, and she grew up in a loving family, but one where religion was painted as clearly false. She grew up, believing that essentially the universe was simply composed of the natural laws of atoms, electrons, everything could be reduced, boiled down to chemistry. And she continued in that view into her adult years and when she got married. But it was the experience of having a child that started to change something in Jennifer. And this is how she describes this. She says, "I looked down and thought, what is this baby? And I thought, well, from a purely atheist, materialist perspective, he is a randomly evolved collection of chemical reactions. And I realized if that's true, then all the love that I feel for him is nothing more than chemical reactions in my brain. And I looked down at him and I thought, that's not true. That's not the truth." And that moment was sort of a turning point for Jennifer, where she went on this journey of looking into whether there was more to life. And she became a Christian at the end of that journey. But I think what Jennifer really experienced there was a kind of a worldview shift from this view that life is ultimately meaningless. I mean, Richard Dawkins has summarized this very pithily when he wrote, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." That's the universe that Richard Dawkins says he sees. But I see a very different universe to Richard Dawkins. I see one where there is beauty and love, truth, right and wrong, justice, a story to make sense of our lives. So maybe we're just looking at it in a different way, but I think at that moment, Jennifer kind of moved from that naturalist atheist way of looking at the universe to saying, actually, maybe there's a different story that I can step into here. And I think it is ultimately about two different stories that are being told about reality. One is a story of ultimate meaninglessness. I mean, the story of materialism is that the universe, whatever hopes, dreams, and aspirations you may have right now on this tiny speck of dirt called planet Earth on the edge of the Milky Way, that'll all be gone and finished 1 trillion years from now. The universe is going to run out of energy one day and will just be a cold, sterile void. That's the end of the story on that view. And then you've got to ask yourself, well, how do I make sense of life, given that that is the reality? And I think it's really hard to. I think it's really hard to make sense of what life is ultimately about. I think the Christian story that says, actually, no, there is a God behind this universe, makes more sense of the intrinsic idea that has been present across every time, place, and culture, that there is something more to life. Because every single culture has asked this question, what am I here for? And if the answer is simply, you're the end result of a purposeless process, most people don't find that very satisfying. In fact, C.S. Lewis, another well-known Oxford thinker, put it this way. He said, a baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. People feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. I love that because there's something about that that says those questions, those deepest longings and aspirations, they're not just illusions. They're not just some weirdness that's been foisted upon us by a meaningless process. There is an actual answer. That's why I find that God makes sense of that ultimate question, that sense of purpose and meaning that people often spend their whole lives looking for. And it's said that the psychologists say that to live a flourishing life, you need two things. You need hope and you need love. People who lack either of those things don't grow into fully flourishing human beings. And for me, the story found in the Christian story makes sense of that. Because in the Christian story, you have love. You have the idea that God himself became human and gave his life to bring you back to himself in the most extraordinary act of sacrificial love on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago. So if you're looking for love, the Christian story has it. If you're looking for hope, on the other side of that story is the story of Jesus walking out of a tomb. If you're looking for something that goes beyond this life, if you're looking for a sense of how to make sense of these deepest longings and aspirations that we all encounter, if you're looking for hope, then the Christian story has that too. It says that death is not actually the end. That the kind of heat death of the universe is not the end of the story. There's something else. There's something else. There's something we were made for. It's an answer to Lewis's question. If I find in myself desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And I think we were. In fact, it's not another world. I think it's a world we can encounter right here and now. So these are three reasons why I think it makes sense to believe in God. Now, I want to be clear. When it comes to my atheist friends, I think they are on a journey and a search for truth. And by kind of making these critiques of the atheist worldview, I'm not disparaging their honest search for truth. But we do see things in very different ways. There's two very different stories of reality at play here. When I look at the world, when I look at our universe, I find it difficult to see that this really is just, a story that doesn't have a beginning or an end, no particular purpose to it. I see a universe that's full of meaning because of the fact that we're here. There's something about the nature of our universe that says, it's really strange if you're just an accident. That seems to fit better with the Christian story than the atheist story of reality. I find it difficult to believe that our deep intuition that there is deep meaning, value, and purpose in the human story is just an illusion. I think it makes far better sense to see that the fingerprints of God are on the universe out there and are found within us as well, in our sense that value really does matter. It matters how you treat other people. And that worldwide, across all times and places, search for meaning, the why question. All of these things convince me that actually it makes sense to believe in God. There are good reasons to believe in God. There is, of course, a follow-on question. If this God exists, has he made himself known to us? And that's going to be the subject of tomorrow's talk in many ways. So I hope you can come back as we look at the evidence for the resurrection. But for now, I hope this has given you something to think about, to go away and ask, next time I look at the world or look inside myself, could it be that actually there's a different story of reality that explains why I'm here and what I'm here for? Thank you so much for listening. God bless you all. Thank you. Cheers.